So good morning. Support systems, is it a necessary evil or a tool at your disposal to really drive value for merchants? So we're going to spend about the next 20 minutes exploring that. I'm part of the Plus organization currently, leading most of the merchant-facing post-sale functions, so merchant success, launch, and related teams. But for 3 years before that, I led the customer support team at Shopify. So this is definitely a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, acting on, and implementing. So at the end of the 20 minutes or so, we will be handling questions. So you've probably done this already, but go to the Q&A part of the app, choose Unite as the code and the Track 2 scaling, and I'll be happy to field some of those questions. So there's really two things that I want to do in this next little bit of time, and that is give some real concrete suggestions in terms of how to scale support systems, but also, as I alluded to in that opening question, is really address why, like why you bothered to do all of this. So let's go into a bit of definitions first. So we all have a reason that our customers come to us, and we generally share the same merchants, right? So they come to us for themes, for apps, for custom integrations, for store builds, for 3D modeling of products, as we talked about yesterday. So there's always something that they come to us for that I'm going to refer to generally as product, whether it's more about code or more about conversations. But then there's a set of things that surround that, and we could really call them customer service, customer care, customer success, customer support. And I'd be really happy to talk about the subtleties. There are subtle differences between those, but I'm going to really deal with that collectively as the ring of things that I will talk generally about support. So what I'm really hoping is true in this talk is that whether you're more in the product code side or more in the conversational side, that some of this will fit. I think a lot of it really will apply, the things that we talk about. So really the question is, why bother? And some of you are large companies, some of you are 1 or 2 person operations, and especially for the small operations, part of the reality is the phone keeps ringing, right? You find yourself Sunday afternoon at dinner with the phone ringing with a question. So there's a practical reality of that, but really the thing that I hope you embrace is that the reason we worry about all of this or do all of this is to drive customer value and build brand loyalty. So customer effort is a topic, so effort and friction is a topic that's really central to a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the next little bit of time. The CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, that's now part of Gartner, they've done a lot of research over the last decade that actually shows that there's an intense tie between customer effort and loyalty. So the kind of flamboyant, go above and beyond kinds of support, I wouldn't for a second suggest you shouldn't do it or that it's not suitable at times. But the thing that really makes customers stay is when things work, when they're easy, that sort of thing. But unfortunately, people who actually interact with support offerings in general, 2/3 of the time, they actually report them as moderate to high effort. What's a little bit worse is that those people that have the high effort experience, they're twice as likely to talk to their friends and family about this. So there's a negative cascade that happens. So it's really made the effortless experience and all the ideas around it a very central part of how a lot of people design their support systems. And that's actually a really key point, that all of this is about how you design your support system. It's a deliberate act, and it's a deliberate set of decisions that I'm going to really address over this next bit of time. So when I talk about a low effort experience, it's not just about that product that we talked about that people first come to you about. It's not just the human interactions, it's also the resources that sit in between, all the self-help and one-to-many things. And it's really how this whole system comes together, that's what your brand is about, that's what the experience, like your customers will take away an opinion of the whole, not just the product part. So when you really ask yourself, how do you know if you're being successful? There's some tangible things. We can look at customer satisfaction of people who interacted, those sorts of things. But really, the more powerful thing is, when you do a good job of this, the biggest business metrics nudge in the right direction. It's not easy to actually find proven correlation or causation because it's a little tricky to separate all the factors. But I've been around this world long enough and have enough gray hair, as you might have noticed, that I know that when you do a good job of these sorts of things, adoption goes up, loyalty goes up, all the biggest business metrics do move in the right directions. So who uses these offerings? And I think sometimes people assume that it'll be the struggling or the weaker customers, but that's really not the case. This is a glimpse at Shopify data that really shows that the actual support team that I used to lead, About half of the customers actually use that service, but when you look at it either by revenue or GMV, it's more striking. And what it really shows is that people that sell a lot, they use the support offering, but they'll use all the resources, right? That's what driven entrepreneurs do. So it's not about the weak, it's about all, and perhaps it's even mostly about the successful. So when you think of this as a system, one of the things is really an opportunity to make it a learning system. So especially those frontline human interactions, every time you have one of those, it's useful to really ask, is there a way that that could have been built into the resource set to actually avert that human conversation? Or better yet, can it actually somehow affect the product in a way that makes it stronger and more resilient, more robust? And so, the whole idea of making this a learning system, there is one model that actually is quite broadly used in industry that makes this systematic. And it's called KCS. KCS stands for Knowledge-Centered Support. What it does is it actually says that the content, the knowledge is actually created as a byproduct of that frontline service and then shared. And then the actual usefulness and use of it is how you reinforce and hone and refine that. So it's a very knowledge and customer-centric model that does this in a structured way. So there's a lot of different human interactions that we'll have over the course of providing support to people. And in the support team, about a year and a half ago, we started really looking at this as a continuum. So it's truly a continuum, but I'll talk about it in 3 distinct buckets. First one I'll call failure interactions. Failure interactions are essentially those conversations nobody wanted to have. It's about a billing error. It's about a product feature that's not working. It's about downtime. Nobody really wanted to have that conversation. So those we'll call failure interactions. There's a middle set that we'll call low value interactions. This is when there's some clarification, some confirmation. There's some, you're actually helping the understanding, but you're not knocking it out of the park with a new value creation sort of conversation. And then at the right-hand side, those highest value interactions, that's where people are already happy with what you're doing, but wondering where to take it next, what more to do. It's where upsell opportunities live. And so if there's a different feel to these different places on the continuum, I'd argue that we should actually try and treat them differently. So it'll never be perfectly true because, as you heard yesterday with our announcements, and I'm sure the same is true of your businesses, we're moving very fast. So there's always going to be something on the front edge that's a challenge. But to whatever degree we can, if we can eliminate those failure interactions, that's a good thing in terms of the overall customer friction level. Right? The low value interactions are the perfect thing to actually try to deflect. So this is where a lot of the self-help resources can play a really great role. And what that does is puts the focus of the human interactions actually on those high value topics. So really the way that would all come together is if we can reduce the failure interactions, it gives us more time to actually spend on those high value conversations. So being deliberate about that. That's a theme that I'm going to talk about a few times, is being deliberate with how we design the system. So I sort of alluded to self-help already, but I want to go a little bit deeper in it because especially in our society, there's a lot of people, a majority of people prefer to start with self-help. They prefer to look for what sort of guides or resources there are, but too rarely does it finish the job. And so the more that we can actually create those that finish the job, it becomes sticky. People will come back to it and they'll be well satisfied. Live channels, you probably all start with live channels. Even the smallest companies, people have your phone number, so it starts there. But there's a bunch of directions that I'm going to say, going cautiously keeps you away from the slippery slope of unnecessary headcount and complexity. So doing it when it actually is wise, and here's the 3 dimensions that I'm going to talk about. So first, hours of operation. Many people would see, if you've got a global customer base, the eventuality of 7x24. But it's important to do it when you're actually ready to do it. I think in Shopify's case, we started 7x24 support at about the beginning of 2014. It's reasonably, I was going to say easy. It's not easy, but it actually works really well now because there's a worldwide team. When I joined in 2014, it was not easy. We had a series of people working overnight in New Brunswick and Ontario, and it was far from easy. So doing it when you actually can do it robustly is the sort of advice that I would give you. Languages. And this is very timely because you heard so much yesterday about translating the admin. So even from a Shopify perspective, anything other than English really began in 2017 as email only, and now it's spreading to more languages and will spread to more channels. But one of the things as you stray away from whatever the original offering was, and I'm sure most of you are working dominantly in English, it's really important that whatever you give them, it doesn't come across as a second-class service, right? When you're ready to do another language, it's got to be done in a way that they feel very important. This one requires a little bit of a deeper look. So channel variety. For a long time, we've thought about, and you need a little bit of sophistication to do this, but trying to influence where people go with a question. What channel they actually use. Do they phone you? Do they look at a self-help guide? And previously, we would have thought about that mostly around technical topic, like where's the best place to talk about domains? Where's the best place to talk about payments? That sort of thing. But I got exposed last year to a piece of work, again by the CEB, that argued that the whole jobs to be done structure is a really interesting way to look at channels. So this is going to be a quick glance at it. So for those that don't know, the jobs to be done framework was popularized by Clayton Christensen about a decade ago in the Innovator Solution. And the jobs to be done framework really looks at what a product or service is being hired to do. Why did that customer actually decide to spend money on something? A really good example to illustrate it. A number of years ago, McDonald's realized that over 50% of their milkshakes were sold before 8:30 in the morning, which surprised them a bit until they looked deeper. What they actually found the milkshake was being hired to do was to be a one-handed, nourishing breakfast that lasted more than 20 minutes to combat the boredom of a commute to work. So when they actually understood the framework of why somebody would spend money on a milkshake before 8:30 in the morning, they had really got to the crux of what it was being hired for. So the same sort of thing can apply to channels. So if you think of channels that are available like social media, chat, voice, those sorts of things, the actual hired job in social is often to vent, often to just say something and vent. On the other extreme, like a live voice conversation, is more to discuss or explore. And so if you're at the stage that you can actually influence where your merchants and customers land, if you go a little deeper into this jobs to be done framework, it's very interesting how satisfying that actually will be for our merchants. Blur. This is a good blur. This is not things going foggy. This is technology-enabled blur. And there's a couple examples I'm going to talk about. When I showed this system earlier, I implied that they were distinct strata. And really the point I'm making now is technology is allowing us to bring them together in that friction-reducing way. So two really good examples are automation. Most of the chat bots or any sorts of automation that we see today usually start in the knowledge layer, the knowledge base, the resource layer, but have some escalation ability if that's not doing the job fully to move to the human. So that's actually an example of where those two are coming together. A place that product and the human interaction come together are any time that you place that communication opportunity in the product. So it's true for us in the Plus admin, but I bet most of us have phones in our pocket that have at least one app where there's an ability to communicate when there's a challenge. So those are bringing those layers together in a way that makes things easier for our customers. So when we think about who our customers are, it's really worthwhile thinking about segmenting. And not only from the perspective of are there customers that are more important than others, there's truth to that. But the other point that I would really make is that when can your customers absorb and make best use of a piece of advice? And so that's actually one of the things within my current team that we're working on this year in the merchant success world, is how do we actually follow the journey that our merchants take in maturing and give them the advice and recommendation and tools at the right time. So that's another form of segmentation, to actually think about it from a sort of maturity perspective. So from a tooling point of view, Shopify is a company that builds a lot. And even what we're using in our support world, some of it, we've bought, like we use Zendesk as our backbone still for everything, but a lot of the other things that surround that we've built. But for most of you, I would say you really don't need to build it. There are tools like Zendesk, like Help Scout, Intercom, Gorgeous. There's many things out there. And they're advanced enough, whether they play a single role or whether they're sort of the omni-channel platform that you use across the support system, you really don't need to build things to the degree that was true even a few years ago. So all these interactions that we talk about, there's a real value in tracking and recording them. And when you're small, if you're one or two people, you're answering the questions and you know how to build it into your offering. So you don't need to be very systematic. But as you grow and evolve and roles become more specialized, it really does change. There is a need to be more systematic. We've taken it pretty far as a company. So for about 3.5 years now, we have a team called the Product Support Network. And their sole function is to really be the connective tissue between the front lines of support and the product teams. Now, most of you won't have to be that systematic or take it that far, but if you're recording and tracking, you have the ability to dive in, to look for patterns, look for trends, that sort of thing. So I think even early on, I think it's quite wise. And I was at dinner last night talking to one of our partners that is 6 or 7 people, and they're using Zendesk, and all of this is recorded. So that's a great start. Consider proactive. So most of what we've talked about is reactive. They're coming to you. But in designing this system, actually thinking of what kinds of things can be proactive without being creepy is really valuable. So the kinds of things would be in-context messaging, social media, triggered events. When you actually can watch your merchants journeying through whatever it is you're offering them and know the timing for a piece of advice, it's very, very powerful. This is sort of the last big topic, and that's be careful what you measure. When we think about support structures and systems, you could actually measure things in sort of 2 basic ways. One would be towards the aim of minimizing cost. The other would be to the aim of maximizing value. If you're trying to minimize cost, you'll look at things like cost per interaction, call times, wrap-up times. If it's about value, you'll more look at repeat contacts, first contact resolution, things like that. And the importance here is, when you think back to that value continuum I talked about earlier, if we actually succeeded at driving those failure interactions away, the number of interactions would drop, but they'd go up in how long they take because they're rich, great conversations. So if you measured using the left-hand side of this, you'd actually think things are going in the wrong direction, and that wouldn't be the case. You'd actually be really happy with it. So I'm going to share a story. So it was fall of 2015. I was actually doing a deep dive into the communications that had happened in the previous week. I was looking at emails. And one of the things, this was when I was leading the support team, that I found was that there was a lot of communication about strategic programs. If we were implementing a new tool, anything like that, there was a lot of email, there were a lot of Slack messages. But what there wasn't was a lot of communication around the day-to-day operational performance, answer rates, wait times, those kinds of things. There just wasn't a lot of talk about that. So I got a bit noisy about it, really around the fact that we're a big operational team and we didn't look to be acting that responsibly. And so people don't always listen to me, but this particular time they did. And so in the number of weeks that followed, what I really saw first were all very positive signs. People were acting responsibly. People were paying attention to wait times and that sort of thing. So it all seemed good. Before the year ended, in one of our AMAs, and I mean, Ask Me Anythings are a big part of Shopify's culture. That support team is about 90% remote, working from home, so they're even more important, so we do a lot. And the question that came up was something about the 10-minute call time limit. And I remember my answer being, oh, I'm sorry, you misunderstand. There's no call time limit. You know, we need to interact as long as it takes to deal with our customers' challenges and drive value for them. And then it came up again and again. And what I realized by early that following year was that our wait times and our call times, those were all coming down, but so was our customer satisfaction. So inadvertently, what had happened was our frontline leads had become very good at managing the time dimension, and it had given us an unintended outcome. So what we had to do metaphorically was absolutely put the stopwatch away. We had to really take the focus off time and move it back to value. So really the moral there is measure things that reinforce your business goals. And I think the other real thing is it'll never be one thing. There's always a number of things that actually come together as metrics that really tell you if you're succeeding towards those business goals. So what I hope this has done is really made 2 big points. One is be deliberate in your support system design. There's a lot of choices. I think I dealt with about a dozen of them. But there's a lot of choices you have in terms of what you put together. And it's going to be different when you're 2 or 3 people than it is when you're 200 people. But be deliberate in designing your support system and really think of it as a complement to your product and driving value. So hopefully that's what's happened, and it's been really awesome to spend this time. I'm going to move to a few questions now. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, the first question is from Chris. How tied to direct impact, conversion, sales growth, should ongoing service relationships be? Is it justifiable or a liability? That's a really interesting one. And when I joined the support org in Shopify, I decided to go to a lot of industry conferences because I think doing things differently intentionally is great, but in ignorance isn't. So I've had this conversation with a lot of people, whether essentially tying sort of value selling or upselling into the support activity is the right or wrong thing to do. I really like it, as long as it's not an explicit, overt, they sound like they sold to me. Like if in the support activity, you're actually teasing out challenges that your customers have, and you can find something that they actually are really better off when they capitalize on it, there's nothing wrong with offering that. But it's got to be that way around. It's got to be truly because you believe it's going to add value for that customer. So I think as long as that's the case, I'm an advocate for it. Next question from Katie. How do you handle employee capacity and motivation when the work lifestyle is constantly changing? Is there anything you would recommend focusing on in downtime? Yeah, it's probably hardest when you're small because like, do you go to needing a full-time support person? And even when you go from 1 to 2, like you're fully doubling the capacity. When you're going from 200 to 201, it's a little bit easier. It's actually a beautiful way to work proactive in. And that was actually one of the things that was true earlier on in the Shopify team was, the reactive was the priority because people were needing us. They were coming to us. But if there were pieces of capacity, some proactive reach outs would fit. So I think there are ways there. There was mention of lifestyle. Our support team that's so heavily remote, we had toyed for a while with part-time, and that's a way of really flexing capacity. But what we found was the training cycle was actually long enough that it was not a good return on investment, and it wasn't a good experience for people either. Just the amount of time they had to put into understanding the product and being good at the service, like it was important for them to deliver a full week's worth of work. So those would be some of my thoughts on that challenge. Next one from Anonymous. In your research, have you found an average number of failure interactions before a customer leaves? Oh, I wish it was that clear. Failure interactions are large. Like I think in a lot of people's business, it's nicely up into the double-digit percentages, and so I actually don't think it's having failure interactions that actually cause a customer to leave. It's how well you deal with them. I mean, if you have too much of a string, that's obviously it may be fatal. But even when they do occur, if the same ones at least don't recur, if they're dealt with positively, dealt with constructively, really part of the trick is to try and move those conversations to the right in that continuum. And I've actually seen a lot of examples where something starts as a failure interaction about a specific thing, like especially a live interaction like a phone conversation. Often there's 2 topics dealt with before you actually get away from each other. So even those that start with a failure interaction, if the customer is particularly irate, you probably don't want to try and redirect it. But a lot of the time you can deal with the pain point that's first brought, and then actually look at what's going on with that merchant and maybe make some other kind of suggestions. So I think sometimes you can pivot away from the failure interaction, and that's really going to save that loyalty and confidence. From Katie. What do you see as the biggest mistakes teams make that prevent them from being profitable? Are we talking about the support team itself being profitable? I don't know where Katie is. Because I wouldn't aim for that, and I wouldn't even aim. The biggest metric to me, and it's not an easy one, is to actually look at how the team is driving value. And if the team is driving value, it'll be the sentiment analysis that comes from customers, those kinds of things. Those ultimately will lead the whole business to be profitable. So I think the biggest mistakes is to actually focus on cost. The biggest mistake is to drive down those times to try and be super efficient. Efficient is actually a word that kind of scares me. So one of the, in about probably beginning of 2015, we put 5 big priorities together for the support team. And one of them that we did use was operational effectiveness. But we really strayed away from efficiency. So effectiveness meant build out the teams in the right time zones, have the capacity so that we have reasonable wait times, but trying to drive to hyper efficiency, I think would be one of the biggest mistakes. And from Yoni, what are the best practices to keeping support reps experts on every new product development? Yeah, it's a constant battle to keep training current. It's a matter of having good resources that are facing internally as well, like having a good resource base and knowledge base, because I don't think it's reasonable. It depends on the complexity of what it is you're supporting. Certainly in the case of Shopify, there's no way that we ever would expect somebody, whether it's a support person or our merchant success managers, to know all that's going on, to know all the details. So they have to be resourceful more than they have to be completely knowledgeable on it. So having a good set of resourceful behaviors and a good knowledge base that they can draw on. Again, this is as you sort of scale up, and eventually, that's really the key. I think more than expecting that they're going to learn and memorize. Do we have more questions? That was in the first list. Now I've got some other incoming ones, maybe. Yes, we do. All right, from Narubi. How do you measure the success of the support team, and how do you measure each team member's performance? So it's been about 7 months now since I'm in that team, so I'm on the plus side now. But generally, the biggest metrics have been customer satisfaction, so in our case called Smiley, and a program called the Ask. So the Ask in the support world of Shopify is really measuring every time there's a recommendation made to move from monthly to annual, to utilize Shopify payments, things like that. So finding other ways that the Shopify platform can deliver value for merchants. So that's tracked, looking at sort of how, what the size of that activity is. And then the other one is really wait times. And so we've really stayed away from like how long is the call, but is the right capacity there so that people aren't waiting too long to actually get to a human being. So those would be 3 of the really big ones that I think are still the measures in that team. From Siba, how do you optimize the contact between devs and support? So I talked earlier about this thing called the product support network. And early on, when you're small, you don't need that because it's just easy to work together. That team does a few different things. They actually prepare for launches. So every time there's a major feature launch, they make sure that the support training is in place. They make sure that the customer-facing documentation is in place. They do a rating of how well done that launch was. But the other thing they do, we actually call it archaeology, they do deep dives into those tickets. Because there's like thousands of tickets a day, thousands of conversations, we use things including speech analytics to actually look for sentiments. And so they'll take a cut at, let's look at all of the conversations about domains, and it might be 20 or 30,000 interactions that they'll look at with the speech analytics and say, like, what are the themes that are coming out of that couldn't be found sort of one conversation at a time? But again, that's a fairly advanced team. But I think if you're at a smaller state, have people sit together. Have a support person sit in the dev team. Have them talk a lot on Slack. Like at the start, I think it can be much more organic and still like tackle those same principles. From Anonymous, at what point should a scaling business start to build structure around support? Very early, I would say. I mean, even if you're a couple people, those ideas of like recording what interactions you're having, like you may not need yet a full-time support person, although I think often teams aren't many people before they actually put somebody in that role. But some of those things I've talked about being deliberate, do you start to build a knowledge base? Do you start to build things? I think most of those things that I talked about today, you can actually take baby steps when you're very early, and I think it'll serve you really, really well. From Anonymous, no, sorry, I already dealt with that one. From Siba, tips on optimizing the impact customer service has on tech team. It's learning. I think it's really, every technical team, every development team, if they're not actually hearing from the front lines, if they're not hearing the pain points and what's going well. I mean, one of the things that I know about our developers is they try and spend time, like looking at tickets, like listening to customers, and sometimes it'll be the positive things. Maybe you've done something part way and it's really working well. It sort of gives fuel to that. Take that further. So I think it's really, I hope it's not too cliche, but just listen, really. From Anonymous, for service-based businesses, what are your thoughts on pricing for support? Does hourly pricing disincentivize communication? Yeah, it does. And the whole concept of charging for support, the more that's close to what you're actually doing as a business, of course you have to charge for it. But I think the whole charging for it does remove the incentive to actually have those positive conversations. So, and tiering makes sense. I mean, sometimes the level of service that you'll give to higher paying customers, is valid. I have time for one more. In a small team, how do you know when to hire the support besides the development team? Yeah, I think I touched that earlier. It's partly workload. It's like, is the amount of requests actually overwhelming the developers? Do you actually need to segment the capacity? But bringing the right person, they can actually build that system that I talked about. So I think that's how I would think about that. And I got to 0 seconds. That was exactly the planned time. So thank you all. I hope this has been useful.